The air is thick with tension, a storm that's been brewing for centuries, but the first cracks begin to show today. The city stands on the edge of a precipice, and its walls, once mighty, begin to crumble. The empire that once stood as a colossus, unyielding and eternal, is finally showing signs of its decay. But you don't see that from where you stand, not yet. All you can see is the smoke, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows that stretch like fingers, reaching for something far darker than you can comprehend. Beneath the fading embers of a once great civilization, something far more sinister is at work. A child's cry echoes through the night. But it's not just any cry. It's the kind of cry that breaks more than just the silence of the night. It breaks the innocence of an entire people. This child, no more than 6, does not scream because of pain. He screams because he understands, even at this young age, that something terrible is happening. Something that will tear his soul apart before his body even knows what's left. This is where the story begins. This is where history veers from legend into truth, where the cost of empire is paid in blood. Your blood, my blood, and the blood of those who will never be remembered. But no one dares to speak the truth. Not yet. Not until it's too late. The price of silence is too high, and today, the bill is finally being delivered. For centuries, the empire's glory has been told in the grand strokes of history. Its military, conquests, its architectural wonders, its sultans, whose names echoed through every corner of the world. To the untrained eye, this empire seems untouchable, a monument to civilization. But what they don't tell you, what history books dare not reveal, is the story buried beneath the marble, behind the golden gates of palaces that once seemed to stretch forever. Because in those dark chambers, the empire's true legacy was written not in stone, but in the silent suffering of the very people it claimed to protect. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the world watched in awe as the mighty Ottomans, led by Sultan Mehmed, shattered the Byzantine capital with a precision and power that was unmatched. The city, once a shining beacon of faith, fell not just to a military force, but to something far darker. What happened next was not mere conquest. It was systematic, cold, and calculated exploitation. The Ottomans, known for their tactical brilliance and fierce expansion, had perfected the art of empire building. But what was lost in the shine of their military success was the truth of their methods. What they concealed from the world was a practice so brutal, so intimate, that it would make your blood run cold. It wasn't just the soldiers on the battlefield who were taken as spoils of war. No, the true price of victory was paid by those who had no part in the battle. The innocent, the powerless, the women, the children. They were the real trophies. The world was kept in the dark about the systematic removal of entire populations, their fate sealed by decrees that were written in ledgers, not in the cries of the oppressed. The empire's cruelty wasn't just a byproduct of war, it was a deliberate strategy, one that used the bodies of conquered people to fuel its endless hunger for power. No one questioned it. Not then. And now, centuries later, the truth is buried so deep that to speak of it is to defy history itself. When the Ottoman Empire swept through cities and villages, its conquests were marked by more than just military dominance. They were governed by a meticulous system of control that extended far beyond the battlefield. Once the dust settled and the flames of war subsided, the real machinery of conquest began. A cold, calculated system that saw human bodies not as individuals, but as tools to shape the empire's future. For the Ottomans, power was more than just an abstract concept. It was physical, it was intimate, and it was brutal. What the world saw as war, the Ottomans saw as an opportunity to expand their control over human lives, over desires, over bodies. This wasn't just about military might or strategic alliances. It wasn't even about the riches of the conquered lands. This was about something far deeper, something far more insidious. It was about the systematic exploitation of intimacy, an abuse masked as conquest, where the body became the ultimate instrument of power. For women, the first step of their exploitation began immediately after conquest. They were separated, categorized, and processed like cattle at an auction. The young ones, those between 14 and 25, were the most valuable, marked for breeding, for beauty, for serving as symbols of the empire's power. But the process was not about choice. It was about control, about stripping them of their identity, their humanity, until they were nothing more than numbers on a ledger. Their names were erased, their pasts wiped clean. What remained was a body, malleable, subjugated, and ready to serve the empire's endless needs. The younger women weren't just seen as slaves, they were seen as commodities. They were assigned numbers, categorized based on their physical attributes, and then sold to the highest bidder. Their beauty, their youth, their bodies, they became the currency that fueled the empire's expansion. For the boys, their fate was no less harrowing. Young children were taken from their homes, their families left to mourn the loss. But the boys were not simply sold into slavery. They were turned into instruments of empire. Through the devshirme system, the Ottomans took the sons of Christian families and transformed them into loyal soldiers, eunuchs, or servants of the imperial court. These boys were not taken for their skills or intellect. They were taken for their obedience. They were stripped of their identities, given new names, new roles in the empire, and forced to worship a new god. Their bodies were redefined, not by choice, but by the iron fist of the empire's will. The young ones, those who still had their innocence intact, were reshaped, molded into perfect servants of the Sultan. Their bodies, their minds, they were all transformed to serve the empire. The psychological toll was staggering. The emotional trauma inflicted upon these children, both boys and girls, was unbearable. They were taught to disassociate, to forget their previous lives, to accept their new roles without question. For many, the old identity was gone. It had been erased, replaced by new names, new duties, new expectations. But no amount of training could erase the terror, the despair, the sense of helplessness that they felt deep within. These children, these women, once victims, now subjects of empire, were forced to submit. Their desires were no longer their own. Every touch, every word, every action was now dictated by the empire. They were no longer free. They were no longer people. They were simply tools to be used, abused, and discarded when they were no longer of use. But the cruelty didn't end there. The empire went further. It institutionalized this control. It built systems of surveillance, of manipulation, of coercion. The young boys, now soldiers or eunuchs, were watched constantly. Their every move was scrutinized. Their obedience was measured, tested, and when necessary, punished. The women, those who survived the grueling processes of the palace, were stripped of their personal dignity and transformed into objects of desire, subjected to a constant cycle of emotional and physical abuse. Every act of intimacy became a power play, a calculated move in the larger game of empire building. In the palace, where the sultans held absolute power, nothing was left to chance. Every sexual act, every interaction, was orchestrated to remind these subjects of their place. The sultans and their men were the gods. The women, the boys, they were nothing more than pawns in the great game. These weren't mere historical anecdotes. These were the lived experiences of thousands, tens of thousands, who fell victim to the Ottomans' systematic, brutal control. These were not stories written in the shadows. These were real, documented facts, kept alive in Ottoman archives, in bureaucratic records that showed the true cost of empire. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire wasn't just written in gold and marble, in grand palaces and military victories. It was written in the broken bodies of those consumed by its imperial machine. The pain, the suffering, and the submission, it was all part of a system, stretching across centuries and continents, shaping every corner of the empire. The devshirme system wasn't a one-time event. It was a continuous cycle, a process that fed into itself, growing more efficient and more ruthless with every year. The boys taken from their villages, the sons of Christian families, were forced into service. But it didn't stop there. The children who survived were turned into instruments of oppression. They became enforcers of the very system that had once broken them. For the boys trained to become eunuchs, their bodies no longer belonged to them. Their identities erased, their masculinity stripped away to serve the Sultan's whims. The moment they were forced into that brutal process, they lost everything: their pasts, their futures, their very sense of self. What remained was a hollow shell, shaped to serve, to obey, and the soldiers, the janissaries, fared no better. From the moment they entered the empire's grasp, they were taught to fight, to bleed, to die for it. Their loyalty was bought with promises of status, power, and privilege. But they were just cogs in a machine, soldiers serving the empire's endless thirst for control. The brutality didn't stop with the boys, though. The women, the young girls, the mothers, those who survived the initial processing, the categorization, the systematic erasure of their identity, were forced into sexual slavery. Their bodies were used as instruments of control. These women were not seen as people, but as commodities. Their beauty, their youth, their very existence, measured not by their humanity, but by their worth to the empire. But it wasn't just about the physical toll. It wasn't just about the trauma they suffered in the moment. It was about what happened after. Those who survived became the enforcers of the system. They were given power, privilege, and authority, but at a cost. They had to impose the same suffering they had once endured on the next generation of captives. The boys they had once been were now in their place, subjugated and reshaped to serve the empire. The girls, the survivors, became tools, perpetuating the cycle of submission that had been carved into their souls. The cycle fed off itself. The empire didn't just conquer lands. It conquered lives, identities, souls. It knew how to break, to exploit, and to mold. The Ottomans knew how to break a spirit, bend a will until there was no fight left, until there was nothing but obedience. The chilling aspect of this system was its efficiency. It wasn't chaotic. It was systematic, controlled, and calculated. From the moment a child was taken to the moment they were processed in the imperial palace, it was all planned. The empire's power didn't come solely from its armies. It came from its ability to shape people, to control them, to make them forget who they were and what they had lost. And the survivors, those few who made it through the system, were not free. They were not liberated. They were broken shells of what they once were. Their pasts and futures had been stolen. They existed only to serve the empire, to continue the cycle of control. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The empire's power wasn't just in its military. It was in its ability to reshape the essence of its people, to make them forget themselves, and to ensure they would never rise against the system. The brutality of the Ottoman Empire's methods didn't stop at the boys or the women, nor was it confined to the walls of the palace. What happened in the deepest chambers of Topkapi, what was recorded in the ledgers and scribbled in the archives, was more than mere conquest. It was a system, a terrifyingly efficient machine designed to erase the humanity of every individual it touched. For years, this practice was a well-guarded secret, protected not by physical walls, but by the silence of the victims and the deliberate concealment by those who had benefited from it. The empire wasn't just built on the backs of slaves. It was built on their complete transformation into instruments of power, humans reduced to tools for the empire's success. But there was one truth hidden in plain sight: the children. The system may have started with the devshirme, the systematic recruitment of boys and girls, but it morphed into something far darker. The forced mutilation of young boys, the brutal removal of their genitals, wasn't an accident, nor a sporadic act of violence. It was ritual, a ritual so vital that it became law. Boys who survived this mutilation became eunuchs, symbols of power, tools used by the Sultan and his court to maintain control over the empire. This wasn't a private matter. This wasn't a system of power confined to a palace or a private home. It was a public spectacle meant to show the empire's complete dominance over its people's bodies. Eunuchs became visible signs of the Sultan's control, paraded across the empire, their bodies permanently altered in service to a cruel system. The truth about this practice is as horrifying as it is systematic. The documentation of these procedures, the meticulous recording of numbers and statistics surrounding mutilation and exploitation, reveal a deeper level of control than most can fathom. Yet for centuries, this truth was buried in archives, in ledgers, in private collections of those who shaped the system. Victorian archaeologists, who stumbled upon this truth, were faced with something they couldn't comprehend. They didn't just find objects of historical value, they found evidence of massive trauma, psychological and physical, inflicted on thousands of children. But instead of confronting it, they buried it. They hid it behind closed doors, in secret vaults, under the guise of academic respectability. This was not the history they wanted to share. The empire they revered couldn't be tainted with such brutality, so they chose to forget. They chose silence. But now, centuries later, the silence is no longer enough to protect this truth. The stories of the boys, of the girls, of the lives transformed and destroyed, they demand to be heard. These were not just casualties of war. They were victims of a system that relied on silence to maintain its grip on power. What happened to them wasn't some isolated incident. It was planned. It was institutionalized. It was a cold, calculated effort to break every aspect of humanity and turn it into something that served the empire's needs. The boys who survived the mutilation, the eunuchs, lived out their days in a paradoxical state, with no future of their own, stripped of their pasts, existing to serve the empire. The women, taken for their beauty and youth, their worth calculated by age and health, were turned into living commodities. This wasn't just an empire, it was a marketplace of human lives, traded, bought, and sold for the empire's gain. The brutality of the Ottoman Empire was not only written in the blood of battlefields or the grandeur of palaces. The true cost of this empire was hidden in its silence, a silence that existed in the dusty archives, in the whispers between its victims, and in the meticulous bureaucracy that erased identities and histories. This silence wasn't a mere accident. It was a deliberate tool, woven into the empire's very structure, and it came at an unimaginable cost. For centuries, the victims, the boys, women, and children, had no voice. They were erased. Their names disappeared into the depths of history, ignored by those who preferred a sanitized version of the past. The empire's glories were celebrated, while its darkest chapters were buried. Victorian archaeologists, driven by their biases, concealed the truth, choosing to protect the empire's reputation over confronting its cruelty. But the truth cannot remain hidden forever. The silence surrounding these horrors has been shattered. The archives that once kept these stories sealed are being opened. The lives that were stolen, dehumanized, and repurposed into instruments of power can no longer stay hidden. Their stories, once footnotes in history, are now coming to light, revealing the dark heart of an empire built on fear, violence, and domination. The cost of this silence wasn't just the erasure of names or the disappearance of identities. It was the loss of humanity itself. The boys who were turned into eunuchs, the girls reduced to property, they weren't merely victims of war. They were victims of a system that stripped away their personhood, reducing them to mere tools. Their bodies, their futures, their identities were no longer their own. They belonged to the empire. Even now, the question remains, how did this happen? How could an empire so proud of its grandeur sustain itself on brutality? Why were the voices of the victims erased from history? How was such suffering allowed to continue? The answer lies in the price of silence. Silence became the empire's weapon, a tool to maintain control by suppressing the truth. It was easier to bury the truth than confront the horrors that lay beneath the empire's facade. As long as the victims' stories were silenced, the empire could continue to thrive. But what happens when silence is broken? When the truth comes to light, the empire's foundation begins to crumble. The system built on fear, manipulation, and control is revealed to be fragile. Every new revelation, every uncovered story of suffering, weakens the empire's grip. Now, in the present day, we understand the cost of that silence. It's not just the erasure of lives or generations, it's the price of forgetting the darkest parts of history. This silence, which once protected the empire, now threatens its legacy. We risk repeating the same mistakes if we don't acknowledge the past and learn from it. The cost of silence goes beyond historical trauma. It is the failure to prevent history from repeating itself. How do we break this silence? How do we ensure the victims of the Ottoman Empire are never forgotten again? The cost of silence is too great to ignore. The shattered lives, the broken bodies, they deserve to be remembered. Not as casualties of war, but as victims of an empire's relentless hunger for power. Only by breaking the silence can we truly understand the true cost of empire and ensure that history is never repeated. The Ottoman Empire may have crumbled centuries ago, but its legacy, its haunting, quiet legacy, still echoes through the corridors of history. It's easy to see the grand palaces, the opulent gardens, the military triumphs that once made this empire the jewel of the world. But what we don't see, the stories buried beneath the weight of history, are the lives that were sacrificed for that glory. The silence that surrounded these lives was not simply the absence of words. It was the absence of justice, the absence of humanity. As we look back now, we must ask ourselves, what happens when a civilization is built on the backs of its most vulnerable? The boys, the girls, the families who were erased from the pages of history. They were never meant to be forgotten, but they were. Their pain, their suffering, buried so deep beneath the empire's grandeur that it was hidden for centuries from the world. Their names, their identities, their humanity were erased not just by the Ottomans, but by every historian who chose to look the other way. The silence that protected the empire, that buried the atrocities beneath a veil of sanitized history, has only made the echoes louder. The victims of this empire were not just numbers. They were people, they were children, forced into servitude, mutilated in the name of power. They were mothers, forced to watch their children die or be taken away. And yet, for so long, they were forgotten, their stories lost in the shadows. But we can't afford to forget them anymore. We can't afford to ignore the cost of empire. It wasn't just gold and land. It was human lives. It was families torn apart, souls broken by the weight of imperial domination. And as we stand here in the light of modernity, we must ask ourselves, what price are we willing to pay for the power of our own empires, our own systems of control? These were not isolated incidents. This wasn't just one empire's story. This is the story of every empire that has risen on the suffering of others. It is the story of power and how it corrupts, how it uses the human body and spirit to maintain control. The Ottoman Empire may have fallen, but the systems it built still exist today. They're just more hidden, more sophisticated. As we uncover the truth piece by piece about the atrocities committed in the name of imperial power, we must ask, are we truly free of these systems? Or have they just adapted, taking new forms, hiding behind new faces? The silence of the past is no longer enough to protect us from the truths we must confront. The question remains, how many other legacies, buried in silence, remain to be uncovered? How many other empires throughout history have left their victims forgotten, their pain erased, their stories lost? The Ottomans were not the only ones to wield power through fear, silence, and oppression. We may think we've learned from the past, but how many of the same systems are still active today, shaping our world? The silence that protected the Ottoman Empire's horrors is no longer enough. We have to break that silence. We have to make sure that these forgotten victims are never erased again. Their stories are not just history. They are a warning about the cost of power, the price of silence, and the cost of forgetting. As you leave this video, I urge you to reflect on what you've learned. How much do we really know about the history we study? How many stories are still waiting to be uncovered? And most importantly, what price are we willing to pay to uncover the truth? If you've been disturbed by this hidden history, if you felt the weight of these forgotten lives, I ask you to share this video. Let's make sure their stories are told. Subscribe for more, and let's continue peeling back the layers of history together. There's so much more to uncover, and the silence must end.